Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Christy, for the introduction. I hope you all hear me. So I will start unless there is any reason for me to believe that you're not hearing, in which case I suppose Christy will let me know. Well, I'm very honored to be able to present this webinar today, and I hope I will help you knowing and understanding the Korean market better. The presentation I prepared is probably focused more on, well, trade publishing and maybe literature a bit more because that's the field I'm working in. But I will be happy to reply to questions that you might have after, and to the extent of my knowledge, I will reply today. And if I can't, then I will try to do some more research and maybe help you out according to your needs. So I'm going to start now. Well, obviously with a brief introduction of Korea. You can read the slides, but just to say, it's a relatively small country with a still growing economy, very dynamic. 51 million inhabitants, and since the country is relatively small, it's a very, very high density of population. All the economy and population are centered around Seoul, the capital, and another particularity is that the literacy rate is very high. So it is 3 times as big as my country, Belgium. I don't know about the ratio to Canada, but I can tell you it's much more smaller than your country. I've been living here for 8 years, almost 9 years now, and I can tell you that the dynamism of the country and the economy is one of the things that I like the most. This also is reflected in the book market, of course. Focusing more on the book market from now on, a few important facts is that Korea, South Korea. If I say Korea, it's always South Korea. We used to say always Korea here, but North Korea and South Korea live in different worlds, and when I mention Korea, it's always South Korea. So please keep that in mind. South Korea is a member of the Berne Convention for Protection of Literary Works since 1996, and according to sources, it's the 10th or 12th largest book market in the world. Importantly, it's the 3rd largest book market in Asia, just after China and Japan, that are, of course, much bigger due to their much larger population. This last year, or more precisely 2 years ago, 2012, most of the data I'm going to tell you about today are from 2012, because the data for 2013 are not yet in. Well, there's been about 39,000 new titles published in 2012, which is still pretty high, but as you will see later in the presentation, it's actually decreasing in comparison to previous years. We'll get back to that. It's also a very homogeneous market. As I said, it's centered around Seoul, and most of the book sales also are in Seoul, but there are also other major cities like Busan and Daegu and Incheon, which are very dynamic and with a large population. But most of the trends, and of course the language, Korean language, is the same. So we do not need, as publishers, we do not need to have a different approach for a region or another, like in many other countries, I suppose. It is a homogeneous market, which is really a plus. And also, importantly for you, is that it is a fairly translation-centered market with a large proportion of translations. About 25% of the trade publishing is actually literature in translation, or well, literature in the broad sense. So translations make up for about 25% of the trade publishing, which is a fairly strong ratio if you compare to other countries. We'll get back to that later. The imports and exports of books and literary content. I've put some of the recent data I could find in the slide you can see now. An important thing to point out is that exports of books and literary contents are usually not as high as imports, and main imports are from North America and Europe, and then other Asian countries like China, Japan, Southeast Asia. Exports are a bit different. There's less exports to Europe and to China as well. These are actually data that include books, but also, as I said, licenses, literary content in general. The trade book publishing and retail in Korea, we're going to focus on this now. An important number is the number of publishers, which is very, very high in Korea, and it's constantly increasing. There were less than 4 years ago, there were 35,000. Now there are more than 42,000 registered publishers. I don't know about 2013. It's probably increased even over 2012. One reason is that it's very easy for people to register as one-man publisher or as publisher. It's very easy and very cheap. So a lot of people who have a project of publishing books do that, but they don't necessarily manage to publish the book. And actually, most of those 42,000 plus publishers actually are not active. This is reflected in one of the impressive statistics about how active they are. 95% of publishers have not released a new book in 2012. And I don't know about the ratio of how many publishers publish more than 5 or 6 books a year, but I suspect that it's a very small percentage. So maybe there's only a few hundreds of publishers who are really active and publish more than, let's say, 10 or 15 books a year. Also importantly is that there are some very large groups. I will give you a list a bit later. There are some large trade publishers, but most of them are still independent or privately owned or family-owned businesses. So it's very different than other countries like the US or France, where there's a higher concentration in groups. And here it's mostly, even the largest publishers are still privately owned. Now moving to retail, this is also impressive. If you see that in 20 years ago there were a bit less than 6,000 bookstores in Korea. Now there's less than a third. Depends which sources you trust, but it is fair to say that it's decreasing every year, and there are now less than 1,800 bookstores in Korea, which is very little for a country with 50 million inhabitants. Publishers are not too worried about that because they think most of the bookstores that disappear are independent bookstores. I think it's a very sad trend, and I hope there will be reversal if possible. Some new independent bookstores are flourishing in Seoul and other cities, but right now what's happening is that they are closing down, and mostly the chain bookstores are maintaining their market share, not necessarily opening new stores, but they are actually increasing their market share. Among the main chains of brick and mortar bookstores, there's Kyobo, which is makes up for about 30% of the market. And then there's Dandy and Luli's and YP Books. YP stands for Yongpong, and they mostly have large stores like mega stores selling also all kinds of non-book goods, of course DVDs and but also stationery and leather goods, etc. The online retail is extremely high in Korea as well, because the country is not so big. So it's very easy to order a book and get it within a few hours, sometimes the same day, usually the next day at the latest. It's now currently more than 40% of all book sales are made online. Koreans are very, very connected, so they have online buying habits that are very strong, and books are, of course, one of the items that they buy online. The main online stores, to give you a few names, are Yes24, which is the biggest one. Interpark is a larger shopping mall, online mall, so it sells books but many other items. So if you see, like, the 2012 sales are actually higher than Yes24, but in terms of books, Yes24 is by far the biggest. And then there's also some outsider, Aladdin, which is smaller but very active, and one of the three most important online stores. There are talks about Amazon joining the market. I don't know whether this is going to happen, but it seems serious. So let's see how Amazon will fit in that in this market, which is already pretty much saturated, because there's not only those three players I just mentioned, but also the brick and mortar chains like Kyobo and YP Books and Dandy and Luli's. They also sell books online, and also other more generalist online shopping malls like G Market and other brands do sell books as well. So it's a very fairly competitive market, the online retail in Korea. Moving on to book buying and reading habits of Koreans, this is the bleak part, because it shows that there is actually almost an anti-reading trend right now in Korea. I really hope this is not a lasting trend. But if you see the monthly expenditures on books, they're less than $20 US per household per month. They're steadily decreasing. Book consumption overall has dropped to its lowest point in more than 10 years. And there is, according to a survey made in 2012, only 12% of Koreans have spent more money on print books, and whereas 27% have spent less in 2012 in comparison to 2011. And ebooks are a bit better. The ebook market, we will see, is still quite small, but of course it's growing. So 36% of Korean readers have spent more money on ebooks than the previous year, and 7% only have spent less. So this is encouraging for the ebook market, but it should be actually higher. And the ebook market is still at a very early stage, as I will tell you a bit later. Koreans like to chat, social networking, watching dramas, Korean dramas on their smartphones, especially when they're commuting. There's hardly anyone reading a book right now, whereas 5 years ago it was still one of the occupations that one could witness. Since then, the smartphone has appeared, and it's a terrible, almost unfair competition for the books. People are actually sometimes reading on their screen, but mostly webtoons or probably very easy things to read. I don't see a lot of people reading novels or nonfiction on their screen. It's mostly watching or messaging. So internet is the big culprit here, like in many other countries. It is actually a very, very high competition to reading, and it's not likely to get better anytime soon because the new habits of cultural content and digital content are actually going towards more video, more messaging, etc. So we will have to see how this goes. And I really hope that the publishers and the book industry will be able to provide attractive content for people to start reading on their screens again. But yes, I'm not exactly as optimistic about this as I would like to. Another batch of statistics here, according to the same 2012 survey, 56% of Koreans read print books only. A very small percentage read ebooks only 2%. 13% read both types of print and or ebooks. 85% do not read ebooks at all, and more worryingly, 29% do not read books at all. In 2012, 12% increased their book reading time, and 42% decreased their book reading time. And then this is also a bit curious. 29% of people who replied to the survey said that they like reading, whereas 32% say they don't like reading. I don't know where the rest 39% think they are. Probably they don't have an opinion about whether they like reading or not, and this is also a bit worrying. Well, I hope this is not giving a too bleak overview of reading habits in Korea now, but yes, these are the data that I found. About the frequentation of public libraries and bookstores. About public libraries, there are a bit less than 800 public libraries in Korea, and much more if you include the school libraries and university libraries. 36% of women and 29% of men go to a library at least once a year. As for bookstores, 58% of women and 49% of men go to bookstores, go to a bookstore at least once a year. About the age of well, the age-related data and statistics I put in the slide. You can see that actually teenagers are by far the ones that go the most to bookstores and library. I suspect that they go there not really necessarily to read books, but maybe to study. So, or because they have to, but well, and this percentage decreases as their age increases. Another interesting statistics is that single people tend to go much more, about twice as much, to libraries and to bookstores than married people do. And well, this is very sad, and I suspect it's because when you marry in Korea, which most people do actually, well, you get so much easier than book reading or book buying is less of a priority. The positive point is that there's a very, very high divorce rate in Korea. So I don't know, it doesn't appear in the data whether people start reading again after the divorce, but let's hope they get a bit more active on in that field as well, and book buying and book reading. Okay, this is also one of the alarming parts. If you see if you take a closer look at the publishing industry data about 2012, you can see that in 2012 there's been less than 40,000 new titles published by Korean publishers, whereas in the preceding maybe 10 years, it's always been more than 40,000. In 2006, it was 45,000. Well, it has decreased in 2012 by 10%, the number of new titles published. And translations, which make up for about 25% of that number, have also decreased in 2012 by 12.3% over 2011. Literature has suffered minus 10% in 2012. Social sciences in translation have suffered a bit less. There's been only a slight decrease, but as you can see, children's. I've taken only a few segments to show you. Children's literature have decreased by more than 20% in 2012 in terms of new titles published, and the comics market as well has actually seeing a decrease in the number of new titles published. The market segments where the number of new titles published decreased the most were actually educational reference books, children's books, science, and comics. And then the only segments I could find where the stats are not in the red, meaning where more titles were published in 2012, are history, philosophy, and social sciences. The main market segments, I'm not going into details. You can read the ones I've gathered based on the Korean Publishers Association's data for 2012. Well, literature makes up for about 20% of the new titles published, a bit less in terms of copies printed because the print run is not so high. I suppose this reflects more or less the landscape and the segment repartition of many other countries. In terms of new titles, for instance, also reference educational books don't make for such a high percentage, only 5%, but much higher, more than double percentage, 12% of the copies printed because the print runs are higher. These are further data showing the average print runs by some selected segments. The average first print run in all segments was in 2012 of 2,200 copies. The number of copies printed overall has been less than 100 million for the first time in 10 years, I think. So it's always been more than 100 million, and in 2012 it decreased by 21% to reach only 86.9 million copies printed. This is very alarming. It reflects that sales actually are not good at all, and publishers take less risk and anticipate less high sales. The average book price, on the other hand, has increased steadily over the years, and last year was no exception. The year before was no exception. I suspect last year as well. Now the average book price in Korea must be a little bit above $13 US. To talk about the positive things, the only market segments where more copies were printed in 2012 are history, philosophy, and social sciences. There is, like in many countries, a book pricing system in Korea. There is a lot to say. There's a lot that's being debated right now, but I just summarized it in a few points, saying that there is actually a fixed book price law, according to which the publishers have to print the recommended retail price on the book, and within 18 months of publication, only 10% discount is allowed. Of course, there are some ways of going around the system, and this is being very much criticized and debated also at the National Assembly, where they are trying to pass, publishers are trying to pass new law to to actually make the book pricing system stricter. It hasn't succeeded yet. I don't know how it's going to be, but it is quite a heavy debate to actually convince lawmakers that a book is a special commodity and should be protected in a different way than any other type of product. There is also, this is interesting, no VAT on books in Korea. To move on to the ebook market, I already mentioned a few words. Well, if you know Korea, the way it's the current cities are very modern and connected, and IT sector is thriving and very dynamic. People use smartphones and tablets everywhere, all the time. You might think that ebook reading is in and is actually thriving as well, but it's not the case at all. The market makes only for 2 or 3%, maybe 4% of the book trade. It is growing, of course, and I was surprised to find as a trustworthy source that there was about 500,000 new ebooks published in 2012 by Korean publishers. This is probably explained by the fact that many of them are actually making their backlist available as ebooks, but the actual sales are still very much behind, and the sales are still not do not live up to the expectations of the retailers and publishers. By way of comparison, Japan has a much larger book market, but also a much larger ebook market, which makes up about 10% of their own market. And of course, the percentage is even much higher in North American countries. Another recent point I would like to mention is that there's been e-readers on the market for many years now, but every now and then the big players on the retailers try to relaunch new e-readers and try to create a trend so that people will start using those e-readers, especially people who read a lot of books still. But those Kindle type e-readers have been a failure so far commercially. There is the Crema, which was actually marketed as the Korean Kindle, and also Kyobo has its own platform and e-reader called Sam, and they have advertised a lot and provided e-readers for very, very low prices, but it hasn't caught up yet. So most of the Korean read on those smart devices like smartphones and tablets, and also on their PC and notebooks. But the use of e-readers is still very marginal. According to several sources, it's less than 1 or 2% of people readers actually using those e-readers. The key segments that one can see right now in the ebook market are fiction, self-help books, business, and social sciences, which are actually large segments in the print book as well. But in ebook, these are the most popular segments. And I am really confident that the ebook market will develop very much in the coming years. There's a lot of factors that slow it down, but the growth is unavoidable, and I think that's a really good thing, because publishers are trying to find new ways to reach to readers, and more and more reading is going to be made through those devices and screens, like in many other countries. I wanted to show you some of the best-selling books in 2013. These are 2013 data from Kyobo. Kyobo is the largest retailer, and the Kyobo best-selling list is considered as the authoritative list. It's one of the references. There's not a more accurate or better list than Kyobo's list. So I'm using Kyobo's list for 2013. Of course, Kyobo has many bestseller lists by categories, but this is the main, the overall sales, the 10 best-selling books. I'm not going to go into detail, but you can see there's a lot of Korean authors, Japanese authors. There's a good mix of fiction and nonfiction, with three self-help books. As well as the number one, the essay that is written by a monk, a Buddhist monk, whose name is Haimin, and I think it was the best-selling book the previous year as well. 2012 and 2013, 2 years in a row, was the best-selling book. It shows a very, very strong trend right now on the Korean market. Is the trend that's called that's been labeled as healing or meditation, or I will get back to that a bit later. But it's a very lasting trend that started several years ago and is now there to stay, apparently. So these are for the best-selling books in 2013. If you have any questions later about those, I'll be happy to answer. These are the covers of the books that are on the previous list. I thought these slides needed a bit of a visual, and maybe you can see how colorful and varied the covers of bestsellers in Korea are. As you can see, also, sobriety is not really a trend in design right now. There's always a lot to read, a lot to, some have those little bands advertising whatever prize or whatever sales figures publishers wanted to put forward to sell the book. Also, if you have questions about book design, I'll be happy to answer. This is another bestseller related table. In another retailer, Yes24, which is the largest online retailer, still print sales. You can see that the main segments represented in the top 100 best-selling books are literature, Korean literature and foreign literature. If you see the data from 2009 to 2012, it's clear that Korean literature is still strong. Almost always about 20% of the top bestsellers are Korean literature, whereas foreign literature was about at the same level 4 years ago, and is now actually about half of what it was. Foreign literature is one of the sectors that is now, unfortunately, for us, Open Books, the publisher for which I work, it's unfortunate because it's decreasing alarmingly, and unfortunately for you, I suppose, because some of you are probably literature publishers, literary publishers, and opportunities are a bit these are tougher sales than it used to be. But I really I have hope that this trend will change. But right now, it's one of the undeniable trends in the Korean market. Korean literature is still going strong. Foreign literature is going down. Self-help books have always been well represented in the top 100 since many years. And yes, you can see this table more in detail. I'm going to move on. In ebooks as well, you can see that the most popular ebook segments are fiction and essays, and then self-help human sciences and also economics, business. The best-selling ebooks in 2012, depending on the two main platforms, the Kyobo and Yes24 were different. You can see 50 Shades of Grey was the best-selling ebook in 2012 on the Yes24 platform. Actually, in the top 10, there were 4 titles by Real Games. 50 Shades of Grey was not a phenomenon like it was in other countries, but of course it's been published, and in ebook it's been doing pretty well and still is. It wasn't a huge bestseller in print, but in ebook, since the market is still relatively small, and for obvious reasons, a lot of people don't want to be reading it in print form in the subway. Well, they bought the ebook and still do. Last year's #1 ebook overall was The Great Jungle, which is a novel about China, a trilogy or a 3-book novel by a Korean author, Jo Jong-rae, and it is a reference to the Great Wall of China, and it's called The Great Jungle. You can call it The Great Jungle of China, and this was a huge bestseller. It still is, in one of the biggest sellers of last year. And in ebook, it was the best-selling title. The main trends the main current market trends I started mentioning a bit earlier is, first of all, healing, or one might say life philosophy. Those are not really self-help books. This would be unfair to say that, but they're like sometimes very similar, and it's about giving practical advice to people to find happiness or wisdom in an age of increasing uncertainty. It's very varied. One of the trends that one can see today is that a lot of those books that sell very well in the healing trend are actually written by philosophers, or in case of Hemin and others, monks, Buddhist monks, including a Japanese monk, Ryonosuke Koike, who is also very popular here in Korea. Another trend is what one calls adult fables, novels that feature universal themes with a local touch. For instance, Hector and the Search for Happiness by François Leroy. I will go back to that a bit later, but this is actually not a recent novel. It's been recalled to the Korean readers' attention through TV. I will mention it a bit later. There is also heightened interest in China, as well in fiction as in non-fiction. China is obviously a subject of interest to a lot of Korean readers. Segments that have seen an increasing popularity over the past 5 years clearly are Korean literature, human sciences, and self-help. Whereas the segments where one can see that they are less popular than they used to be are now foreign literature, unfortunately, business, economics, and language. This is what I wanted to mention about the François Leroy book, which is a 2004 book, the 2004 novel. Recently, it has been featured on TV. Last year, it has been featured on TV in some talk show, and then it caught on. So without that boost, it would never have been such a huge seller, and it is really it's still on the bestseller list now. It's the #2 best-selling book for last year overall. What I want to say here is it's kind of a worrying trend as well. Entertainment has always made books to sell. But this trend is actually getting stronger, and one can see that nowadays marketers think that they really need a Hollywood blockbuster to boost sales of this or that book, or product placement, which is of course not free. Product placement in Korean TV dramas or TV shows is a very common practice. I checked the best-selling list today on Kyobo, and the #1 book is The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane by Kate DiCamillo, and it's a 2006 novel. And I've asked a colleague about why this book is so suddenly going through the roof, and the reason is that it's been featured heavily in a very popular drama, Korean TV drama, which has pretty high audience. And then since it was featured in the drama, people have started buying it actively, and it's #1 right now in Korea. There are also celebrity endorsements in many different ways, including in sometimes translations made by celebrities. So you will see not only that I recommend this book, but also I translated this book, and it is a way of catching the interest of readers. I cannot really judge whether those translations are good or not, but it's one of the symptoms of this trend right now, really heavy trend in Korea, that you need to have some kind of media coverage, not just reviews. Reviews actually don't really make books sell a lot, but mostly being featured being an adaptation of a Hollywood blockbuster like Les Miserables or The Great Gatsby, or being adapted as a Korean movie, or being seen as a product placement in a Korean drama. To move on to Canadian literature in Korean, I put some. There's of course more, but these are the names I was aware of, and some Canadian novelists published in Korea, and some Canadian graphic novelists published in Korea. Of course, there are more. There's also a lot of non-fiction writers, journalists, and others, like, for instance, Preacher Freeland, who wrote Plutocrats. I was actually doing good here in Korea as well. It's clear that the main language that's translated in Korea is Japanese by far. About 40% of all the translations, which means about 10% of the Korean trade publishing is actually Japanese books translated into Korean. And the second most translated languages is English, followed by French, German, and Chinese. So as you can see, Canada is really well positioned because of the two national languages. Oh, okay. Apparently, I should stop moving. I hope you can hear me. Yes, I would just want to say, based on the slide that we're viewing right now, that English and French are just after Japanese as the most important translated languages, which is, of course, really good for Canadian publishers to try to find Korean publishers to publish their books. It's also two of the languages that are not too difficult to find good translators for. If you move to very international languages like even Spanish or Arabic, obviously finding a good translator can be really difficult, even Spanish or Portuguese or Italian. Of course, Dutch and Danish or Czech, these are usually not direct translations, but indirect translations. I'll get back to that a bit later when I talk about the common practices in in literature and translation in Korea. This is about fiction, but I want also to show you the 20 best-selling foreign novels in 2013. You can go back to it later in the PDF. I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of those names. Here again, France and Japan and USA are the most represented countries. Very famous authors here in Korea have a very loyal readership. And for instance, Bernard Werber, Guillaume Musso, they publish a lot, and almost all of their books are bestsellers. Korean readers are really loyal, and this explains this table, the 10 best-selling foreign authors over the past 10 years. This is also a table that's been displayed by Kyobo Bookstores. Sorry. So the Kyobo Bookstores made public their sales from November 2003 to October 2013 over the past 10 years. So the 10 best-selling foreign authors were all novelists, and you can see very close to each other, Haruki Murakami, who's a superstar, and Bernard Werber, who is a superstar in Korea. I have sold a bit less than 800,000 copies in Kyobo bookstores only. Paulo Coelho, Dan Brown, J.K. Rowling, these are really big names. And then you see those Japanese, in total 4 Japanese novelists in the top 10. And Douglas Kennedy is number 10. He's an author, I think, who's probably more successful, popular here in Korea than in his own country. These are also authors who publish a lot, and almost all of their books are bestsellers. To move on to what probably interests you most and makes the most of my presentation is selling translation rights in Korea. I put on a list of the largest trade publishers, some of which you're probably already familiar with. This list doesn't really show even sometimes even larger publishers, educational publishers like Kyo-won. These are like the trade publishing groups. And a group like Minamta comes up at number 10, but it's actually several brands and several companies, and if you put them together, it's probably much higher. It's one of the largest groups. Munak Dongne is also one of the largest. It has a lot of imprints, and they're very, very active in foreign literature, whereas Changbi is a really big publisher, but they barely translate. If you want more information about those groups as well, I'll be happy to answer. This is just to give you an idea and of the sizes, and these are like 2012 figures. I suppose it's changed a bit, but not significantly. Here, I suppose all familiar with the Korean literary agency system. I've put a lot of information or advices about them in these slides, which I'm going to go over quickly. Of course, I suppose for you it's a no-brainer. You need to work with an agency if you want to penetrate the Korean market. I suppose I am an exception in the Korean publishing, where there are not so many foreigners, and I have a preference clearly for working directly with foreign agents and foreign publishers for different reasons. But I also work with agencies. It's really, I think, convenient for most of the Korean publishers. They would prefer to work with Korean agencies, and Korean agencies know the market very well, so they can target They can also, because of the language, they can get more information more easily. And so I suppose you all work with agencies. I've put on this slide the big four and a few names of others, but there are many others. And some are specialized in some fields or in some languages. I couldn't really give you a precise overview, but also about this, if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer. So what I just mentioned is because of the language barrier and because of the fact that Korean publishers are still more comfortable to work with Korean agents. Most of the deals will be made through Korean agents, and I suppose for you it's also more convenient if you want to target publishers. But there is a trend I'm starting to notice, is that on the one hand, I think more and more Korean publishers are happy to work directly with foreign publishers as well. And also some foreign agencies, some foreign publishers are actually trying to make it a policy that they would, but maybe not foreign publishers, but foreign agents like the Wiley agency or other agencies. They now try to establish contact directly with the Korean publishers, so they would know the market better, and they will. They will actually build a partnership or a relationship that is more direct and sometimes more accurate or more transparent than through agencies. I've summarized a few standard practices. I'm sure you're familiar with most of them, so I'm not going to go over this. You can always ask me questions later about what this or that means, but yeah, these are like standard practices of Korean agencies. I've also put on a table about the pros and cons of working with an agent or going direct. I think for most of you, the most convenient would be to work with an agent, but if you want to consider the other advantages as well of working directly, maybe making some exceptions in some cases, especially, for instance, when you work with me, if you work with me. Yeah, I've put on a few ideas. There's more, probably to be very, very objective, there will be more advantages of working with a Korean agent. So, but it might change quickly, and it is already started to change. Something that's important to consider when you pitch your titles to an agent or to a Korean publisher is that, well, you have to do it in English. You can do it in French as well, but there's less agents and obviously less publishers who master the French language. And like in, I suppose, most countries, the main factors that would influence the decision to publish a book in translation will be the name of the author and the sales figures and the commercial potential of the book. Winning a literary prize can be a factor, but it's very limited because literary prizes do not really affect domestic sales, and with the exception of the Nobel Prize for Literature, but that's only one body of work per year, so it's a notable exception. But most prizes actually will not help you. It will help you, but not significantly to get books published. So the thing to focus on is the commercial potential of the book. There are some hurdles, some challenges, like the fact that the Korean readers are not as curious as one might think. Culturally and historically, there's a lot of topics that they're not really interested in. A lot of cultural spheres and historical topics that they're not interested in. It's still, the market is still very, very influenced by the US and Japan and Europe to some extent, they tend to be convinced by foreign sales only, and this is a pity because there's a lot of smaller trends that are really they're strong but less noticeable abroad that actually are not noticed here, and almost no publisher are adventurous enough to go to those more niche segments, and I'm sure there will be potential. And if some of your titles are fall in that category, not high sellers, but maybe with a high commercial potential in Korea, that will be a point to stress definitely when pitching your titles to Korean publishers or agents. Some advice is some pieces of advice I would like to give to you when you do this. I'm sure these are obvious in most of cases, but something that you might want to use is sample translations to provide good translations of excerpts of your titles to agents who will then be able to first know the title better themselves and see what publisher might be interested in, and then they can forward those simple translations to the publishers. This might help a lot. Also, make sure you provide enough information, of course, about the books, but also that your books are discoverable online. This is also important because a lot of publishers do their own research without necessarily getting information from the agents to start with, and then if the book is not discoverable online, then it is invisible. Also, one thing I would like to stress is that it's actually, for Korean publishers, it's actually relatively easy to get grants for translation from the Canada Council for the Arts, for instance, but probably there are other instances providing grants. I know that very little Korean publishers use those possibilities, and when you are promoting your titles and try to sell your titles to agents and to publishers, it would be good to highlight the possibilities of translation subsidy funding. And always a good advice is to be patient and to follow up regularly. This is the agent's job, but I know that a lot of agents just follow up with publishers when they are asked by their clients to do it, and so the more proactive you are, the more feedback probably you will get. This is more like an overall advice, maybe not applicable to you as a publisher, but maybe for Canada Books to try to promote Canadian literature as a brand, like some countries do, like some magazines also do. Grant publishers like the 10 or 20 the Spanish Hispanic novelists, for instance. Why not do the same with Canadian novelists? That might help get attention to some of the big names in Canadian literature, and maybe also some title-focused brochures or information, like the Dutch Foundation for Literature, publishing very clearly, well-designed and relatively short brochures about 10 books from Holland or 10 graphic novels from Holland, and why not do the same with Canada? This might help actually giving visibility to some authors or to some titles. This is very, very practical, but I put some advices about when you negotiate what kind of what you can expect. I will not read the slides because I think I will be running out of time soon, but you can. It's pretty much self-explanatory. What I would like to stress is that it is very important to tell the agent or the publisher what is important to you. because it might be in the contract, and even if it's highlighted or underlined or in bold in the contract, it might be actually overlooked because what happens is most contracts are summarized by the agent, and the summary provided by the agent is in Korean, and that's usually the only thing that the publisher will refer to, and those summaries are not always accurate, and then they don't always focus on the most important points. So if there are some points that you put in your contract, even if it's highlighted in there, it's not sure that it's going to be respected. So it's very important that you just very easily tell, okay, I want to have a say about the cover. I want to approve the cover, or I want to know when the translation is finished, please. And it's important to tell that at least one or even several times, because agents will typically send it to the just forward your requests or expectations to the publisher, but the editor in charge at the publisher might change in the meantime, and then the information doesn't really go through. So it is important at different stages before the publication to say, okay, we would like to know where you are, and when can we expect the cover? And it is important for us to look at the copyright notice, for instance, so you can avoid some bad surprises about that. And okay, so the negotiations part, I will let you go through that since it's self-explanatory. Yes, this is basically what I said. Make sure you keep in touch with the publisher on a regular basis to remind them of what you expect and what you want, and this should enable you to make sure that you have a say where you really want to have a say. If you don't care about the cover, and you can trust the publisher to come up with a nice cover, but if you do, or if your author is picky about it, then it's a good thing to clearly say that you want to see the cover before the book is published. And there's a lot of changes in format and in cover design. This is a very, very common practice. And sometimes even the title is changed for obvious reasons, if the title is not translatable, or if it's a title that doesn't really come across as such. Sometimes publishers will want to come up with completely different titles, and it's important to be flexible about this and not withhold approval unnecessarily. Of course, you need to have a say about it, and this is also one of the things that you should expect the agent to be careful to tell the publisher that if there's a change of title, it needs to be submitted and approved. But if the approval process can be smooth and quick, this is also important because it's always urgent at that time. Koreans always work kind of in a rush, so if they ask you to approve a title, it probably needs to be approved in the coming days. Then if you can approve it, then to approve it. It's always best to trust the Korean publisher. After publication, this is also obvious. Make sure you get your complementary copies and royalty reports every year, but I don't think I need to tell you that. This is important enough for you to know about it, and that's what agents are for. If you do not use an agent, this is one of the things you might want to make sure you send a reminder to the publisher, because a lot of publishers use agents, and in case of the direct deals, directly concluded deals, they might first send the royalty reports to agents and then maybe sometimes forget about that, or maybe send it too late. So make sure you remind them about it. Few common practices that are very common here in Korea and maybe not so common in other countries is I wanted to point out indirect translation. It's still very common. I mentioned that some languages, even important international languages, are like Portuguese or Spanish, for instance. They're not always. It's not always easy to find direct translation. Sometimes a Spanish book might be translated from the French. In the past, a lot of books in translation were actually translated indirectly through Japanese. Well, I don't think it's the case anymore. And I think anyway, in case of English or French, which are the languages that are yours, there won't be any case of indirect translation. But it's good to know that this is a very common practice. Most in case of novel, and sometimes in case of nonfiction, current publishers will ask the translator to write a short piece, which is not necessarily an academic piece, but more like their opinion about the meaning of the book, and it's sometimes like a few pages, 5, 10, or 20, or sometimes more, but it's not a huge addition, but this is a very, very common practice as well. The postface by the translator. Also, another practice that I was myself shocked about, and then now I understand why Korean publishers do that, is book splitting. When a translation is published, it's usually higher page count, higher volume than the original, sometimes 20 to 30%. So in case of large voluminous works, it adds up to sometimes 700 or 800 pages, in which case volumes are too big for the Korean market. It's technically feasible to publish a 1,000-page book, but what publishers will do is simply split in two and publish the book in 2 or even more volumes. Sometimes it also helps them to increase their income, because they can sell the book more expensive. Well, it's a practice that is barely criticized in Korea. I wanted to show you 2 examples. I said the covers change a lot, but this example I took is The Casual Vacancy by J.K. Rowling. The publisher Minaksuchak did use the same cover, and for the second volume just reversed color cover. The Umberto Eco book, which is 520 pages, became an 800-page. The Proximity was published by us, Open Books, and with another cover, which is not an original cover, which is a cover from the Polish edition, and so we split the book in 2 because 200 pages was too big, and also I suppose it was a marketing decision. This is barely criticized in Korea, and I rarely hear complaints about the fact that actually it allows publishers to sell at a higher price. Well, I mentioned changing the book cover is also a very common practice in the title, and the format itself, it's kind of a hardbound paperback, the most common format. It's in between. There is no clear distinction between hardcover and paperback, and usually publishers publish in one edition, sometimes they make a new edition, but there is no clear hardbound hardcover and then mass market paperback later on. It just doesn't exist, and mass market paperbacks overall are not very popular in Korea. About translation in Korea, it's not as good as it should be, unfortunately. Still, from the English or French, which are the most well-known languages, with Japanese and Chinese maybe, for which there's a pool of available translators who are good translators. Still, in those languages, sometimes translations are not very good. There's a lot of factors explaining that. The fact that translators, like in literary translators, like in many countries, are underpaid and the contracts are very unfavorable to them. So I suppose a lot of them are not so motivated to stay in the field or to go the extra mile to make a lot of research. And then unfortunately, there's a lot to say about literature translation in Korea, and it's far from what it should be. There's also no association or union for translators for literary translators in Korea. Editing as well. A lot of editors actually are not familiar with the original language. Usually they are familiar with English and French when they work on English or French books, but it's not always the case, and this is really worrying that publishers are not paying more attention to that. As a result, actually editing and correcting is actually limited to bare minimum. I mentioned also that there are some programs for editors and publishers in Korea, including at the SBI, which is the most famous Seoul Book Institute. A lot of editors come from the Seoul Book Institute, and they have different programs for editors, designers, and book marketers. I don't know if you're interested in Korean literature. It's experiencing a little boom right now, also abroad. The Literature Translation Institute of Korea, the KLTI, formerly known as KLTI, now it's LTI Korea, is very active to promote Korean literature and get it translated in as many languages as possible. Also, we have an international book fair, which is not as rights focused as other book fairs. It's mostly sales focused for Korean readers, but still it's growing, and we have guests of honor every year. And Korea is trying to raise its profile as a literary nation abroad. In 2005, it was the guest of honor in Frankfurt, and as you know, it will be the market focus in this year at the London Book Fair, which is the reason why you are here listening to my presentation. Also, a notable piece of news: Incheon has been Incheon is a large city just next to Seoul. The Seoul International, the airport of Seoul is in Incheon. It's just an hour away from downtown Seoul, and it's connected to the subway. And Incheon is very dynamic and has been elected as the World Book Capital next year. I wanted to compile some. I don't know if I have time to go through this. Maybe this is more anecdotes about what has been selling well. I wanted also to take examples and case study of unsuccess stories, but I thought the success stories were more interesting. Donna Verber is a very popular author in Korea, and since 20 years it's been having almost a bestseller a year. And there are many factors that explain this. The fact that 20 years ago his best-selling book, Les Fourmis, The Ants, which is a trilogy, has been published with a huge success here in Korea, and there's been a love story between Korean readers and Donna Verber since then. And as I mentioned, Korean readers are very loyal, so even if Donna Verber produces less interesting books from time to time, still he sells and he reaches an audience. I mentioned Verber because he's one of our authors, and I know his body of work pretty well, but it's the same about other best-selling foreign authors in Korea. They usually maintain a very loyal readership. Another success story here was, it was not a huge seller, but The Sense of an Ending was a really good example of good marketing and change of cover and change of image overall of a book. Julian Barnes is not an easy author and has been published by another Korean publisher in the past with very little commercial success. But the sense of an ending actually hit a chord, and they sold 50,000 copies in 2012. And now that the 18-month no discount window is over, the publisher is actually selling at a discount price, and it's still on the bestseller list now. Probably they sold over 100,000 copies in total, and it was mostly because they changed slightly the title, and they did it in a clever way, and they changed the cover and made a very active promotion. So the fact that the book won the Booker prize is not the main factor for the success. It's mostly because of the way the publisher approached their marketing, and I suppose that I haven't read it in translation, so I don't know if the translation is good, but I suppose the translation is good as well. Alain de Botton is also a big seller here in Korea. Essays in Love has been published in the title under a new title, which is Why I Love You, which was a bit less serious and gave a more a lighter touch, and the cover as well is very different, as you can see on the screen. There's been a first edition in 2002 and then a second edition 2007, which is the cover is pretty similar to many covers here in Korea. It's kind of cute and mostly illustration more than photos. It is, I don't know about the sales figures, but it's been a strong, steady seller for years, and it was on the bestseller list last year as well. This is an older example, but I found it interesting. The book Silence Speaks from the Chalkboard of Baba Haridas by Haridas was released under the same title and did not really sell well. And then when another publisher republished it in 1999 under a new title, The Sweeper Who Became a Saint, then it caught on, and it eventually sold more than 700,000 copies at that time. And then another success story is Chicken Soup for the Soul. For Koreans, chicken soup doesn't mean anything, and if you translate it like that, you have to basically put a footnote on the cover to explain what it means, and it wouldn't work. So what they did is, what the publisher did is just use the subtitle 100 and translated the title as 101 Stories to Open the Heart, and it was a really big success in the 90s in Korea. So sometimes changing the title is actually a very good idea if you want to reach a broader audience. Well, I'm slowly reaching the end, and we're going to be able to move to questions. I just want to conclude as an outlook for this year that, well, of course, the Korean market is right now in a slump, very deep crisis that everyone here in the field will tell you about. But there's hope, because there's hope that trends are gonna change a bit. There's of course a very high probability that Koreans are going to continue consuming foreign books. Books in overall, but also foreign books. It's a very foreign-focused, translation-focused market and dynamic market, and a lot of Korean publishers have good ideas about how to promote their books in the future. So those who will be the most inventive and dynamic will actually come up probably stronger out of this crisis, and I am sure that for Canadian publishers, there is a lot of business opportunities for you to look forward to with Korean publishers or agents, and I really hope this is going to be the case. And if I can help you connecting with anyone in the field, I'll try to.